Hi everyone. I'd just like to say before I start the final chapter, a very big thank you for all your support, kind comments, likes and shares over the last 30 days whilst I've been doing this. And I hope that in some way it might have brightened up your lockdowns a little bit. It's certainly been a bit of a learning curve for me, and I haven't always got things completely right. But yeah, in general, I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Right, okay, so here goes. Chapter 30, Unfinished Business. D.I. Harris sat at his desk, as he had been for the last 2 months, still poring through the reams of historical documents that the College of Arms had sent over, containing even the smallest of references to the Order of Pepin, the Pepin family, and the mysterious holy relic that seemed to be at the heart of his new line of inquiry. He was becoming increasingly concerned that the case was in danger of going cold. The DNA evidence that had been gathered from the Mount had drawn a blank on the national database. The historical documents he had managed to read so far had provided some fresh leads to living descendants of the Pepin family, but after further investigation, none of them could have been involved in the shootings. His normally upbeat attitude was wearing thin. Even his wife had commented that he might just have to let this one go, or he was in danger of running himself into the ground. He would leave home for work in the same exhausted manner that he would return, a recipe that in her opinion was not all that healthy. But she knew what he was like, and that once he had the bit between his teeth, he would stop at nothing in his quest for truth and justice. Rubbing his tired, strained eyes, he was in the process of reaching for the next folio from the Rouge Croix Pursuivant, when the phone on his desk rang. Hello? D.I. Harris speaking. Glenn, do you ever answer your mobile? Or read emails, come to that? Asked the now familiar voice of Becky. I must have forgotten to change it last night. I haven't checked the emails yet today. Why? What's happened? I've been trying to get hold of you all morning. There's been a development which I think you'd be interested in. To do with my case? Yes, the National Ballistics Intelligence Service have had a ballistics match between one of the bullets found at the Mount and one used in a recent armed robbery in Jersey. Oh, that's fantastic news. I started to think the neighbours had forgotten about me. When did this happen? 3 days ago, but obviously it has taken them a few days to finish the tests. From what I understand, it was a botched armed robbery. Whereabouts in Jersey? I have tenuous links between my case and Jersey. A place called Noirmont? Noirmont. That name sounds familiar. I'm sure I've come across that name mentioned in some of the documents I've been reading. Fuck. I just can't remember which one. I have so many folders here. Glenn, chill out. It's only a ballistics match. That gun could have been recirculated a dozen times since the shooting at the Mount. Yeah, but the odds on it being used at another location, with which there are links to this case, is highly improbable, if not part of the same case. Tell them I'm coming out there ASAP. Okay, I'll let them know, but don't get your hopes up, Becky replied, before hanging up. Glenn felt reinvigorated with the news of the potential break in the case. His adrenaline was running so quickly that he almost forgot to inform the super of the good news, as his mind raced to work out the quickest way to get to Jersey. Boss, neighbours have a ballistics match to my case, in Jersey. So what are you still doing here? Go, go! Get a flight from Exeter. I'll get my secretary to make the arrangements. You'll be on the next flight out. Come on, boy, get going. God knows how long you've been waiting for this." Glenn didn't need to be told twice. He dashed out of the building and hit the road to Exeter like a man possessed. The next 7 hours of travelling seemed to pass by in a blur before Glenn's flight finally touched down on a small runway at Jersey Airport. Upon departing the plane, he headed straight for the Hertz depot to organise for some transport. He knew that Jersey police would have been more than happy to drive him around, but he not only wanted to maintain some independence, but also to keep a low profile while he carried out his investigations on the island. It was late in the evening by the time that Glenn had sorted out a car and checked into a B&B in St Helier. As much as he wanted to start his inquiries straight away, he conceded that it was far too late in the day to do anything productive. The ballistics report wasn't going anywhere, so Noirmont could wait until the morning, wherever the hell that was hidden on this tiny island. After arranging to have breakfast at 7 AM with the proprietor, he crashed for the night. Tomorrow was going to be the first of several long days, and as hungry as he was, sleep had finally caught up with him. No sooner had his head hit the soft feather pillow, he drifted off into the land of slumber. Glenn awoke early the following morning, feeling refreshed. It had been the first proper night's sleep he'd had for a long time. In fact, he hadn't had as good a night since before this case had crossed his desk. Maybe it was down to the comfort of the quaint little B&B, or more likely due to the fact that his stress levels had receded considerably after the news had reached him of the ballistics match, the first real step forward in the case for some time. Either way, he felt much more like his former self. Having breakfasted, his first port of call was to the States of Jersey Police headquarters, just a short drive from where he was staying. Parking his car, Glenn made his way to reception. A desk sergeant that ironically resembled the one back in Penzance greeted him. Glenn couldn't resist a small smile as he noticed the similarity. "Good morning. My name's D.I. Glenn Harris from Penzance. Could I please speak to the inspector in charge of the shooting that occurred at Noirmont?" "Oh yeah, we've been expecting you. Can I just ask to see a warrant card?" "Sure. Suppose one can't be too careful these days." "Yeah, gotta hate the formality of procedure sometimes. Thanks. Everything looks in order. Just bear with me a moment. I'll just ring DCI Carline, who's been overseeing the investigation. Would you like a coffee while you wait?" Coffee would be great. Milk and 2 for me. Cheers, man." The desk sergeant rang through to DCI Carline to inform him of Glenn's arrival, and then disappeared into the back room to make the coffee. Glenn didn't have to wait long for DCI Carline to make his way over from his office down to reception. "D.I. Harris, pleased to meet you. I hope you've had a good trip over," the DCI said as they shook hands. "Same. Yeah, trip was okay, if a little cramped. Those small planes aren't really designed for my height." "Yeah, they are a little on the intimate side of things. Come into my office and I'll give you an overview of our case. Not sure how much help it will be. This one looks pretty cut and dried." "Really? I understand there were 2 fatalities and 1 seriously injured during the attempted raid." "Well, yes, but it's quite clear from the evidence that this was an attempted robbery gone awry. It was the proprietor who was seriously injured and still in an induced coma at Jersey General. The evidence clearly supports the witness statements that there was a struggle between the guests and the armed robbers, and that during the confusion guns went off, resulting in 2 armed assailants dead and Professor Middleton fighting for his life. Of course, there will have to be an inquest, but I'm sure the findings will rule in favour of lawful killings due to self-defence. To be honest, it was very lucky for the Professor that he had company that evening, otherwise I think the outcome would have been a very much different story. We've seen this sort of thing before, mainland gangs targeting the rich on Jersey. After all, we are a tax haven, and do attract that type of resident. I would have thought that this would tally quite nicely from what I know of your own case. Armed gang targeting a historically wealthy family? Maybe. There are a few avenues that are still open. These events may help to focus our direction a bit. I don't suppose you've managed to track down the rest of the perps yet? Unfortunately not. That's the only part of the case which is still ongoing. Most likely they've already departed the island by now. We had pretty tight security around the ferries and the aircraft leaving for the mainland for the last 48 hours or so, and will continue to do so for a few more days yet. But there are other ways off the island if one really wants to leave. I suppose there may be a possibility that they're hiding out on the island, waiting until the heat dies down, but I think it's highly unlikely. Jersey's a very small, close island community, and outsiders tend to stick out like a dildo in a sock drawer. Forgive my rather crude analogy, but you get the point. Any gang with the moxie to pull off this, or even attempt it, would know they would want to get off the island as soon as possible. The longer they are here, the more likely it would become that they would be caught. Yeah, I see what you mean. Any chance I can have a list of the guests that were present at Noamon? I should like to have a chat with them if that's possible. Sure, I believe they're still at the house, helping out whilst Professor Middleton recovers in hospital, if he ever does. Would you like us to ask them to come down to the station? No, an informal chat would be better, I think. How do I get to Noamon from here? Oh, it's easy enough from here. Just take the A1 to St. Aubin, and then get on to the A13. Take a left after about a mile onto the B57. The manor is just off on the left before you get to Battery Lothrigan in St. Belant. Shouldn't take more than about 20 minutes from here. Let me just get you the list. Oh, and if you find anything related to our case, you will pass it on, won't you? Yeah, no worries. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, right? Now finished with the list of all the guests, Glenn left the States of Jersey Police and began his short journey out to the rocky peninsula of Noamon Point. Glenn almost followed the directions to the letter. Nevertheless, when the road abruptly ended in front of a giant concrete structure erupting out of the cliffs towering above the open expanse of the deep blue, he realised that he must have missed the turning to Noamon Manor and had ended up at the battery. Before he turned around, he took a moment to take in the immense architecture of the fortifications. The Nazis had built them to prevent the British from recapturing the island. They certainly were impressive, if a dark reminder of a period when the British had forsaken the islanders. Ironically, the Nazi forces on the island were the last soldiers to surrender, a whole 3 weeks after the official German surrender. Evidently, someone had forgot to tell them the war was over. Not intending to forget why he was on the island, Glenn spun the car around and retraced his last few tracks. keeping a close eye out for the turning that would now be on the right. No wonder he missed it. The DCI hadn't said it was a crossroads. He took the right turn onto Le Chemin de Bellecreux, leading down to the manor hidden amongst the dense woodland. The great black arched gates were an imposing sight for Glenn as he drove off the main road, down the drive to the ancient house. The significance of the armorial crest atop the centre of the arch was not lost on Glenn. He knew he must be on the right track as he noticed the nut-wielding squirrel standing proudly over the entrance. He was beginning to feel that the tricky little mammal was almost taunting him, getting his hopes up that he was almost at the end of his puzzle, only to have his hopes dashed yet again. Maybe this was just another dead end within the maze. He would find out soon enough. Chris heard the car pull up on the gravel outside just before Glenn's knock at the door. "We are popular at the moment, aren't we?" he said to Gaz. "Yeah, but a little too popular for my liking." "Well, better go see what they want," Gaz replied, as he got up from the chair in the kitchen and went to answer the door. "Good morning," Gaz warmly said as he greeted this newcomer. "How can I help you?" "Morning. I'm D.I. Harris from Penzance. I was hoping to speak to James Middleton," Glenn replied, having seen the name on the list provided by DCI Carline, and making the connection that he must be a relative of the current comatose Peter Middleton. "I'm afraid he isn't here at the moment." "Oh. When's he likely to return?" Sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Gareth. Unfortunately, you've just missed him," Gaz replied, attempting to avoid the question of James's whereabouts. "There wouldn't be Gareth Hargreaves by any chance, would it?" "Yes, as a matter of fact. I would ask how you knew, but I think I already know the answer to that. Anything I can help with in James's absence?" "I was hoping to speak to people present at the armed robbery a few nights ago." "Oh, well, apart from James and his father, obviously, we are all here. But isn't this a little out of your jurisdiction, being from Penzance, if you don't mind me saying? I thought the state of Jersey police were investigating the incident." "Well, yeah, they are. But I'm here because of a related case in Cornwall." "Interesting. Well, you'd best come in then." Chris had been eavesdropping on the conversation going on at the front door. He quickly made his way to join Devon, Rachel and Ollie in the drawing room just before Gaz invited this new detective inside. "D.I. Harris. This is Chris, Rachel, Devon and Ollie. The detective here is from Penzance. Apparently there's a link between what occurred here and something that happened in Penzance." Chris didn't require this extra piece of info. As soon as D.I. Harris had walked in, he'd immediately recognised the detective, whom he'd seen in newspaper articles and at the funeral of Jack St. Aubin. Chris knew exactly which case it was linked to, but didn't show any sign of recognition as the tall, dark detective had entered the room. "Nice to meet you, Detective. Long way from home?" Chris said, taking the lead in the conversation. "Yeah, it's a fair step, to be sure." "How can we assist you? And would you like a drink?" Coffee would be great. Thanks, man. I was hoping I could run through the events of what happened here at the manor." No problem at all, but I'm not sure if we can add anything to what we've already told the police here. I presume you have seen our statements prior to your arrival. Sure, but I always think it's best to get these things first hand if possible. You never know what piece of info may seem trivial. A beat cop here might not pick up on. You have an interesting accent, if you don't mind me saying. You're not originally from the UK, are you? No, I was born in Portugal. Dad was from the States. How did you end up in the UK? Mum was from the UK. Newcastle, in fact. Always wanted to settle down here. Personally, I think I would have stayed in Portugal. Yeah, can get a bit nostalgic sometimes. Especially when it's cold. So, pretty much all the time, Glenn jokingly added. But on the whole, I like the life here. So what brought you guys here? It was a bit of a reunion of sorts, and a getaway from work. Professor Middleton kindly invited us to stay. We're all long-standing family friends. What do you do for work? Well, Devon here's an archaeologist, and the rest of us are consultants. I see. Nice. And you didn't recognise any of the assailants? No, to be honest, it all happened so quickly. One minute we were about to sit down for dinner, and the next armed men were forcing entry into the house. So we really didn't get the chance. I remember one of them was massive. That is to say, he was built like a brick. Apart from him, I can't really give you a great description of any of them. No worries. Was a bit of a long shot anyway. If you don't mind me asking, what's the link between the two cases? Similar MO, and a ballistics match. Obviously, I can't give you the details of my case. Interesting, so you think that it may be the same people responsible for both crimes? It's a possibility. What do you know of the Peapon family? Glenn asked, trying to drop the hammer and gauge the reaction to the name. Never heard of them. Really? Isn't it their crest on the gates here? To be honest, I don't know much about the history of this place. James's father bought it in the late 60s, I think. But I couldn't tell you anything about who owned it before that. What's the connection? Oh, it's not of any importance. I have a personal curiosity with Jersey history. Just wondered if you knew anything about them. Where is James Middleton, by the way? I couldn't tell you. He didn't say where he was going. Only that he had some urgent business on the mainland that couldn't wait. Even in these circumstances, life must go on. Yeah, I know what you mean. Have you ever been to Penzance? No, spent some time in Polzeath and Truro as a boy, but never had the opportunity to go to Penzance. Why do you ask? Oh, you just seem familiar, that's all. I wondered if I'd passed you in the street at some point. Huh. Must just have one of those faces. Do you have a contact number for James? I'd like to speak to him at some point. I do, as it happened, but it appears that his haste to resolve his business, he left his phone behind, so I'm not sure it'll be much use to you. That's too bad. It would have been good to have his input, Glenn replied, thinking to himself that Chris was going to run him round and round in circles. He could tell there was more going on than Chris was letting on, and certain answers just didn't add up. And really, who leaves their phone behind when they have urgent business to conduct while your father's in a coma? Well, thanks for the coffee and the info. It's been enlightening to talk to you. I may be in touch again, And if you do think of anything else, here's my number, Glenn said, handing Chris his card. Certainly, and feel free to drop by unannounced, anytime. Oh, what does James do, by the way? He's recently retired. From what? You'll have to ask him that. I never really did understand his work. Well, thanks anyway. Sorry for disturbing you at this time. Don't mention it. Anytime. And if you do manage to contact James, please let him know I'm after him. Sure, will do. Thank you again, Detective. Hope you have a safe journey back to Penzance. It's been a real pleasure, Chris replied, knowing full well what implications the stressed emphasis D.I. Harris had just used on the words after him meant. I don't like him. He was very clever in the way he probed. Think he may cause us some trouble in the future, Chris said after Glenn had left. You mean he reminds you of yourself? Do you think he knows about the Order and the Codex? He did mention the Peapon family by name, Gaz asked. Possibly. But I really hope not. That will be a big problem if he does. I think he's just trying to rattle cages and see what falls out. You'd better warn James. I hope he's alright and not gone to do something rash, Rachel said, in a worried tone of voice. I think we all know deep down what he's gone to do. And all we can hope for is that he covers his tracks well. Otherwise, that DI will have a field day. I'll contact him later. The DI might be monitoring the phones. I'll have to send James a Facebook message. They've got end-to-end encryption. Harder for people like that DI to intercept, Chris replied. And we'd better make a start on working out the meaning of that bloody riddle with Peters. Shame we can't just ask him. Bloody man never makes things easy, does he? Not to mention how we get the books and map back from Norwood, Gaz dejectedly pointed out. The winter rain poured down through the dark night sky, falling heavily onto the old cobbled streets. The water formed mini rivers as it meandered through the gaps in between the cobbles. The old Victorian-style street lamps, although now electrified, bathed the streets of the old town with a soft orange glow. Most people had retreated inside since the downpour had started, either returning to the comfort of their own homes or to the salubrious confines of one of the many bars that were dotted around the old town. Only the hardiest of smokers intermittently braved the wetness for the much-needed hit of nicotine. If it wasn't for the occasional cherry-like glow on the end of his cigarette and the wispy trail of smoke that followed, most people would not have noticed the tall man half concealed in the entrance of the narrow alleyway just off the main high street. Clearly he'd been standing there for quite some time, as his normally light brown hair looked almost black due to the amount of water that had soaked it. Adjusting the collar of the long black overcoat, he dropped the butt to the floor and snuck out of the shadows from where he'd been observing the comings and goings of the locals. He had seen enough for one night. It was time for a drink. Almost 12 hours had gone by since any alcohol had passed his lips. He wouldn't consider that he'd become an alcoholic since the events at Nouamon, but he knew he was certainly walking a very fine line. A line that now, every now and again, became slightly blurred depending on how deeply the dark dreams that often plagued his periods of sleep tormented him. Dreams not only of that sight of his father bleeding out onto the desk, but also of past deeds and memories that would continue to haunt him for much of his life. Consciously, he could shut these out, but once asleep, they would relentlessly prevent him from completely forgetting his past. It was as if karma was punishing him, not only for previous actions, but also for the darkness that still resided inside him. A darkness that he often struggled to control. He had always known that at some point it would re-emerge, and that when it did, he would be powerless to stop the devastation that would follow. Chaos that may only be restored to order upon his death. What bothered him wasn't that he would only find total peace as he took his last breaths, but that many people would suffer in the meantime. Brushing the excess water from his eyes, he strode off from his viewpoint to the nearest watering hole, the first of many that he would visit that night. He would eventually catch up with his prey, just not tonight. A sense of relaxation rose up through him as that first mouthful of sweet amber nectar flowed down his throat, and it would not be long before his demeanour changed from one of passive obscurity to that of boisterous confidence. It wasn't until he'd probably been into at least half a dozen establishments and probably had twice as much as that to drink when he received the message from Chris. James had indeed deliberately left his original phone at Noamon. Nevertheless, he'd always believed in keeping a backup channel open, just in case the others needed to contact him. In this particular case, he'd elected to keep a Facebook account open, under the name of Samuel Pepys. Facebook was ideal, as it used end-to-end encryption within its messenger service, so only the intended parties could read the flow of information. Chris's message was, as usual, short, brief, and to the point. Penzance detective been here. He's coming for you. Watch your back. James was so drunk by this point that he really didn't care. Let him come if he dares, he thought to himself, knowing full well that he'd be long gone by the time the detective arrived, if the detective even managed to work out where James's current location was. James necked the remainder of his pint, draining it completely of the bitter amber fluid. The message from Chris had at least had the positive effect of reminding him that he'd had some unfinished business to take care of, business that could wait no longer. He left the watering hole he was in and made his way to the only drinking house in town where he would find the information he needed to track down Michael. The Bricklayer's Arms. The Brick, as it was referred to locally, was on the outskirts of town, a bit of a ramshackle-looking building that was ironically in desperate need of a builder to repoint the brickwork. James visited the pub specifically because it was frequented by the squaddies from the local barracks, who would most certainly know where Michael's old haunts were, and where he might hold himself up when he needed to keep a low profile. "Yes, sir. What are you having?" "Pint of Banks, thanks, Mon," James replied, slipping into the local dialect to blend in a bit more into his surroundings. Past experiences had taught him that the locals were a lot more forthcoming if they thought you were from around the area, regardless if you'd never been seen in the place before. "Dunna think I've seen you here before." "Dunna get into town much. Live up in the sticks. Just fancied a bit of a change," James replied. "Got much on this evening?" "Nah, not a lot. You know what it's like this time of year? Regulars just want a good fire and a fresh pint. Aye, can I do better than that this time of year? What do you know? James asked, deliberately using a colloquial term for any gossip. Not a lot, to be fair. Business is okay. Never going to be much after the new year. Apparently there's been a bit of a fuss up at the barracks. Some RSM came back off leave, packed a bag and walked out. AWOL, so I believe. Local, was he? Ironbridge, I think. He's come in now, time and then. Mick, something or other, I think his name was. Guess he just kinda hack it. Hard life, not for everyone. Ah, 'tis that. You forces? Was once, a long time ago. Occasionally miss it, but on the whole I think it was the right time to go. 10 years was enough. Ah, that's a fair stretch. Another pint? No, that's me done for the night. Nice to meet you. May pop in again sometime. Cheers, bud. Any time, Mon. More than welcome. James left the dingy little pub and headed back to the hotel where he was staying. The info that he picked up had sparked a couple of long-lost memories. One that the squaddies always used to refer to him as Mick, and secondly, that he'd mentioned when he first met James that he had a small holding or cottage nestled in a forest on the far side of the river. Revenge was going to be sweet, but for now James needed to crash. A clear head would be required for tomorrow, when the hunt would truly begin. James awoke at around noon. The alcohol that he had consumed the previous night had most certainly delayed him from rising early. Not that this was really an issue. He'd never intended on rising early to head out over to Ironbridge. Night would be his ally in the final part of his quest for vengeance. All he had to do was to find out Michael's address, something that would not prove to be difficult. Michael wasn't Special Forces, and so wouldn't have envisaged the need to go the extra mile and go ex-directory. James walked down to reception of the hotel, in part to check out, and also to borrow their phone book. Good afternoon. Sorry, I know I was meant to check out by 12. I kind of overslept. Not to worry, sir. It's only past, and luckily the cleaners haven't got to your room yet. I don't think there's any need to charge for the extra. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Not at all, sir. We hope you had a pleasant stay. Delightful, thanks. I wonder, may I borrow your phone book? I meant to look up an old friend whilst I was in the area. Unfortunately, I don't have their number. Certainly. One moment, please, the concierge replied before rummaging through one of her drawers on the desk. Here you are. I hope you managed to find the right one. There can't be too many Collinses, can't be that many Collinses living in Ironbridge. I know it's a common name, but it's a pretty small place, so hopefully I'll be lucky, James replied as he began to flick through the directory, noting down a few numbers and addresses just to appear as though there were a few different ones to try, when in fact he'd already spied the one he required. Thanks. Found a few likely candidates. Enjoy the rest of your day, he said as he gathered up his belongings and left the hotel. The 4 hyperboloid cooling towers of the Coalbrookdale power station looked like giant terracotta wine jars rising majestically out of the winter landscape along the Severn as they bathed in the dwindling evening sunlight. James had intentionally waited until the light had begun to fade before making a move over to the birthplace of industry. He knew that Michael would be meticulous in ensuring that nobody would be able to come near the house without him knowing about it. So James's only option was to go in under the cover of dark. Driving through the narrow high street of Ironbridge, past the most famous of Derby's engineering works, a bridge that was beautiful, not just because of the way it seemed to settle comfortably into its surroundings, but also because of its imperfectness. The asymmetry of the arches either side of the centre was Derby's way of mirroring nature, and demonstrating that just because something isn't perfect doesn't mean that it is not awe-inspiring. If anything, the engineer was making the statement that it was beautiful because it was imperfect. James crossed the river downstream and parked in the car park on the banks directly opposite the small industrious town. He sat in the car for a few moments to draw out all his emotions that had been battering him over the last few days, focusing his mind on the task that lay ahead of him, a task that he knew there was no coming back from. As the night began to draw in, and the moonless sky chased the last remnants of the sun away, James slipped silently from his car, stealthily making his way over the uneven gravel track up towards the small cottage where he was convinced Michael was hiding. The inside of the house looked as dark and empty as the night. All the doors and windows were firmly locked. There was no easy way in without making a noise, so James took the direct approach, smashing the front door aside with his shoulder. He heard a loud bang as if another door had slammed shut, and immediately realised that Michael must have gone out the back. James ran as quickly as he could through the unfamiliar layout of the property, soon locating the back door, slightly ajar, in the compact utility room. Following the earthy path from the cottage, he entered the dense undergrowth of the forest in pursuit of the man who had caused him so much anguish. The forest path was wet, and James could clearly make out the hasty tracks of his prey from the ones that had been made earlier in the day by visitors strolling along the footpath. He couldn't see the man, but he could hear his movements up ahead. As the man crashed through bushes and low branches in his desperate attempt to escape his impending doom, James soon realised, as he crossed yet another fork in the path, that Michael may have a chance to evade him. He had not realised that the network of intertwining tracks on the hillside were quite so vast and intricate. No sooner had he taken one fork at a crossroads than he would be faced with another 4 choices of where to go. It was just enough to cause even James to question his bearings. He was in danger of losing his prey. In the end he gave up on following the paths, stopped and waited, pricking his ears up in vain for even the slightest noise that would help him to relocate the turncoat. Suddenly he heard it, a distant rustling in the vegetation, maybe 300 metres away, over on his left shoulder. Spinning on his heels, in a flash he covered the ground as if he were a 100-metre dash, and crashed full force into the dishonourable wretch of a man. Over and over they tumbled and tussled, down the steep hillside. Down and down they rolled, until they both plummeted over the high banks, and into the deep, dark, ice-cold surging current of the swollen river, and were instantly swept away. The rushing torrents encircled them. Strong rip currents ensnared and tore them away from the safety of the river banks as they continued to wrestle with each other. The writhing mass of water sucked them deep down into its depths, smashing the pair into the debris of broken trees, ancient bedrock, and other rubbish entrapped in its powerful flows, only to thrust them back, up once more towards the darkness above, allowing a brief moment to gasp for life, before plunging them down yet again into the convulsing death rolls of the rabid river. The freezing cold water bit deep, relentlessly sapping the strength from both their battered bodies. With the last of his energy, James finally managed to wrench Michael's neck until it snapped, releasing the limp wretch to the mercy of the surging currents. With nothing left to prevent the great serpent from slamming his body into yet another half-submerged boulder, James finally gave himself up to the will of the river. The darkness had won, and as he slipped from consciousness, his final thought was one of contentment. Vengeance was his. Whatever the future held, he had ultimately managed to find some sort of peace. To be continued.